Good evening. I'm delighted to welcome you to the first East Asia by the Book CEAS Author Talk event of 2021-2022 academic year. This event is sponsored by the University of Chicago's Center for East Asian Studies. My name is Susan Burns, and I'm a professor of history here, and I'm also the director of the Center for East Asian Studies. CEAS, as we like to call it, is a U.S. Department of Education designated National Resource Center at the University of Chicago. CEAS supports a variety of activities on campus and beyond to promote teaching, research, interdisciplinary scholarship, and greater public understanding related to the study of China, Korea, and Japan. For more information on the University of Chicago's Center for East Asian Studies, as well as the East Asia by the Book CEAS Author Talk series, please visit the CEAS website and subscribe to receive weekly outreach emails. You can find the links in the chat box. Tonight's program is co-sponsored by the Seminary Co-op bookstores, which are based here in Hyde Park in Chicago. The Seminary Co-op bookstore is our center's long-term partner. It's a non-for-profit bookstore whose mission is book selling, particularly of academic books. If you would like to purchase the book we are discussing tonight, we encourage you to use the Seminary Co-op link that is provided in the chat box. This is a way for you not only to enjoy this very interesting book that we're talking about today, but also to provide support to this unique cultural institution. You can learn more about the Seminary Co-op bookstore by following the link provided in the chat box. We are also pleased to co-sponsor tonight's event with the University of Chicago's Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality. Serving as a resource for the UChicago community regarding issues pertaining to gender and sexuality, the center seeks to bridge research and academic coursework with student development, leadership, and coalition building. This year, the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality is celebrating its 25th year as it continues to advance new forms of interdisciplinary knowledge that connects academic learning to worldly problems and contexts. For more information on the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality, please click the link that's provided in the chat box. Now, before I introduce tonight's speaker, I'd like to remind you all that tonight's talk will be followed by a Q&A session. To ask questions, you can type your questions in the Q&A box, or you can raise your hand using the raise hand function in Zoom, and I will call upon you to ask your own question. Now, let me introduce tonight's speaker. Akemi Johnson is the author of Night in the American Village, Women in the Shadow of the U.S. Military Bases in Okinawa. Akemi's book was shortlisted for the William Saroyan International Prize for Writing. Akemi is a former Fulbright Scholar to Japan, and she's written for an impressive list of publications, including The Nation, The Washington Post, NPR's All Things Considered, and Code Switch, and other publications. She is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop and Brown University, and she's taught writing at George Washington University, the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and the University of Iowa. And she's now living in Northern California. So welcome, Akemi.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you to everyone who's come out tonight. I know the Zoom fatigue is real, so especially appreciate you being here. And I hope we can have a good conversation after I speak for a bit. So as Susan mentioned, today I'm going to be talking about what it's like to live in the borderlands around a US military base abroad, looking specifically at the island of Okinawa, Japan, and drawing on my book, Night in the American Village. So first, just a little bit about me. I am fourth generation Japanese American from Northern California. My great grandparents on my mom's side immigrated to the United States from mainland Japan, the Hiroshima and Nagoya areas in the early 1900s. So I am not Okinawan myself. I traveled there as a journalist and a researcher, and I spent 3 different prolonged stays there. The first, I was actually a college student researching my senior honors thesis. Later, I went back after graduate school as a Fulbright scholar. And then more recently, I was there for a few months updating and finishing my reporting. So I also don't have any personal connections to the US military. That was an equally foreign world to me when I started this project. And that's something that I found true for many Americans, right? If you don't have some personal connection to the US military, it can be a foreign world, especially when it comes to US military bases abroad. So I have a little poll for you to kick things off. And I want you to take a second to think about how many US military bases you think are stationed around the world. How many bases does the US have outside of the United States? Just take your best guess. Okay, so I think we got most of the answers in. So looks like you guys are on it. So about half of you said over 800. And in fact, see, let me share the results with you. You can see that. Okay. Yeah, so it's actually hard to determine the exact number because it's not public information, but people have studied this and they estimate there's at least 700, maybe as many as 1,000 US military bases abroad. And these are big bases, small bases, they're everywhere. They're in Europe, Asia, Africa, South America. The United States is the only country in the world to have this global network of bases, what's been called an empire of bases. And yet, so many of us Americans who are unconnected to the military don't often think about them, might not even know about them. We don't know even how many there are, right? So one of the goals of my book is to shine a light on one of these places and ask, what is it like to live around a US military base abroad in what you could call the borderlands around the bases? What is it like for local people? I try to bring to life one of these places that's profoundly affected by our military, but that many Americans don't know much about. So when we're talking about US military bases abroad, Okinawa is significant because it hosts one of the largest concentrations of US military bases abroad. So think about all those bases that we just talked about, right? About 1 in 8 US service members who are stationed abroad at those bases is in Okinawa. So that tells you something about the concentration of bases there. So I'm going to start showing some images for you. Okay, so I'm sure a lot of you already know where Okinawa is, but for those who don't, here's a map. It's not labeled on this map, but Okinawa is that small arc of islands toward the bottom middle of the screen. It's the southernmost prefecture of Japan. And you can see how far away from the rest of Japan it is. It's just as close to China and Taiwan as what's often called mainland Japan, the larger islands to the north. Okinawa is subtropical. It's got the beautiful white sand beaches, blue waters. This is one reason it's sometimes called the Hawaii of Japan, but there's also some parallels in the histories of the two places. Before Okinawa was a part of Japan, it was an independent kingdom called the Ryukyu Kingdom. And then in 1879, Japan overthrew the king of the Ryukyus, and this was the royal castle, Shuri Castle, and then annexed the islands as a prefecture. After that, Tokyo forced Okinawans to assimilate and lose their indigenous languages and culture and become, quote unquote, Japanese. There's one example of this kind of forced assimilation is that in schools, kids were forbidden from speaking their native language. And if they did, they had to wear a sign of shame around their neck. And the only way they could get rid of that sign was to catch another student speaking their native language, and then they would pass the sign off to that student in this kind of like self-policing. So, today in many ways, Okinawa is like another region of Japan. It's also very different from Japan with its own history and culture and languages, which people today are working to revive and, bring back. Okinawa is also different from mainland Japan, as I mentioned, in terms of the amount of US military bases it hosts. So if we think about that map again, right, Okinawa was just this tiny little part of Japan, but about 70% of all US military bases in Japan are crowded in Okinawa, mostly on the main island, which is here. And you can see all the bases marked on this map. The blue areas are like where they do training in the water too. So I think it's about 20% of the island, especially if you're in the center of the island, they're really hard to escape. So I think, in the United States, at least, if we hear stories about the US military presence in Okinawa, which I think often we don't, but if we do, they're usually not good stories, right? They're about crimes, especially sexual assault that US service members commit. And then we hear about the anti-base protests that they might spark in the local population. This was the kind of story that was in the news the last time I was in Okinawa in 2017. And my book opens with a description of this memorial here, which I visited in 2017. And this was a year after a tragedy had happened. This memorial was honoring that tragedy, and people were still bringing flowers to this memorial, still visiting it. It was in a kind of remote area. And so that really told me, how much people cared about this incident, and we're still mourning it a year later. So what this memorial refers to is an incident that happened in April 2016. One evening, a 20-year-old Okinawan woman named Rina Shimabukuro went out for a walk around her neighborhood in Okinawa, and she never came back. Eventually, police questioned a man named Kenneth Franklin Gadsden, an American ex-Marine who was still living on the island and married to a local woman. Under questioning, he confessed to seeing Rina walking on the street. Then he pulled over and assaulted her, and he led police to her body in the woods, which is this location right here where the memorial is. So as you can imagine, right, people in Okinawa were outraged over this crime. They directed a lot of their anger at the US military bases. Gadsden had left the military, but that's why he had come to Okinawa and he still worked on base as a civilian contractor. So this is, a common response to crimes like this. People react by protesting the military base, and there are slogans like a sticker I saw near this memorial just on a telephone pole that said, "No base, no rape, no tears." As I researched, I learned there is indeed a long history of sexual assault by US service members in Okinawa, which I'm going to talk a little bit about. But I realize when people make these no rape signs, they're often not talking about literal rape, but using these crimes as a metaphor to represent the larger situation, the rape of Okinawa by the United States and Japan. And this is alluding to the history of Okinawa. I mentioned some of the early history, so now we can jump ahead to World War II. I'm sure a lot of you know during World War II, the United States invaded Okinawa. Many believe this was a deliberate sacrifice that Tokyo made in order to delay or discourage an invasion of mainland Japan. And it was a devastating sacrifice for Okinawa. The Battle of Okinawa is notorious as one of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific War. It lasted about 3 months and took the lives of thousands of American and Japanese soldiers. But the highest loss of life was among Okinawan civilians, with as many as 140,000 Okinawan civilians dying, or about 1/3 of the prefecture's population. So 1 in 3 people. After the Allies' victory, the United States occupied Japan until 1952. But I think something a lot of people don't realize is that it stayed 20 years longer in Okinawa until 1972. On the mainland during the occupation, the United States pursued an agenda of demilitarization and democratization and supervised the drafting of a peace constitution. In Okinawa, during the 27-year-long US occupation, Okinawans were not citizens of Japan or the United States. They lacked constitutional rights and participated in only a sham democracy. So it was during this time, the occupation, when the US forcibly removed many Okinawans from their land and bulldozed their homes to build military bases. Okinawans say by bulldozer and bayonet, they built the bases. Even when Okinawa became a part of Japan again in 1972, the bases stayed. So if we look at this quick overview of the history, right, it does seem like Okinawans were victims of the United States and Japan, which is where this rape metaphor comes in. And again, these stories of victimhood are the ones, we often hear coming from the island. But as I spent time in Okinawa, I started noticing something else going on too. And I'm going to read now a short section from my book. And this is from a night in Okinawa when my friend, who was an American named Kate, said to me, I want to take you to a place that's like an inside out sock. And she led me through the entertainment district outside Kadena Air Base in Okinawa City, which is this neighborhood here. Kate and I turned south from the main drag. As we entered a building on a side street, Kate said, "This is either the Okinawa in America or the America in Okinawa. Same thing, I guess." The sign on the door read reverse. She pushed it open, and inside, on a brightly lit stage, was a band in American 1950s costumes. They were either locals or from mainland Japan. The female singers wore poodle skirts and beehives, and the male crooner sported a silver suit and Elvis hair. I felt like I'd entered a David Lynch movie. The song Can't Hurry Love began, and a dozen middle-aged local women rushed to dance in front of the stage. A white man grooved at their center. The bar area was spotted with a few more grizzled Americans. He's probably been here since the Vietnam War, Kate said, pointing at one of them. Sipping cocktails at the bar, we watched the dance floor fill after the band broke into La Bamba. When the Richie Valens hit had come out 50 years before, the island had been under American control. The 1950s and 60s, per the history books, were a time of Okinawan poverty, racial and sexual violence, and land seizure and protest. Life under American rule had been difficult for Okinawans. But here in reverse, the bar goers swimming to Surfin' USA suggested a different kind of memory, a nostalgia for that time. It was Kate's Inside Out sock, a story inverted to reveal a hidden, messier side. So this wasn't the only kind of tribute to America that I noticed on the island. I started seeing so many things like this that seem to celebrate America, and especially that occupation era. And I have some images of these things. So this was a place called Stateside Town, and you can see it was branded with like 1950s American diner imagery, which I actually saw a lot around Okinawa. And what it was this neighborhood of former military housing. So these are kind of classic military houses that are like these concrete boxes because they're supposed to be built to withstand the typhoon winds. And they've been repurposed today as like these cute shops and cafes. And it's become this tourist attraction where the streets are named after American states. This is in a bar area in Keene outside a base, and someone had painted old American cars on all the benches. This is a restaurant owned by an Okinawan couple, an older Okinawan couple who I think their son told me just like loved everything American, and it served like really bad steak and pie and like canned carrots and peas. And you've got this 1950s lady again. This is in the American Village, which is in the title of my book. And the American Village it's like a shopping and entertainment center, but it's also kind of like a Disneyland USA where, you know, the idea of America is commercialized and becomes a tourist attraction. So this is one store in their USA headquarters. This is the American Depot in the American Village, and you can see the Statue of Liberty there. Inside this store, you can buy all this old US military gear. I'm not old, like US military themed goods. There are the old US military posters on the wall, Uncle Sam. You can buy like old TV guides from the 80s, which I was like, kind of blew my mind. And here's the American Village. It's actually a place like local kids and US military families actually go to hang out. So it's not just a tourist attraction too. So, you know, as I spent time on the island, I started noticing a more complicated story than this victim narrative we often hear. The Okinawans I met didn't seem to see themselves as victims of the United States. Instead, many were choosing to actively engage with the US military presence in some way. Of course, they had agency. And, you know, something else I saw was that for many people, the lived experience of these bases could be very intimate. Over the years, the military presence had become a part of their everyday reality, their families, their identities. And this was something that helped the bases have staying power in Okinawa. So I started collecting stories that represent a range of experiences between locals and the bases. And I decided to focus on women because they arguably have more contact with the bases than men. They're the ones more likely to date and marry US service members, work in the entertainment areas around the bases, and be the targets of sexual assault. So my book is organized around 11 women who I profile. Each chapter is named for a different woman. And I'm going to read the opening of one of them now, called Eve. We drove south toward Naha after 11 on a Saturday night. On the left, the base fences flashed, silver and barbed wire. On the right were convenience stores and used American furniture shops with names like Graceland and USA Collectibles. Camouflage and gas masks hung in the windows of thrift shops. Eve turned up the American hip hop on the stereo. Ladies' night, she exclaimed. Tonight she might meet her future husband. 29, Eve was an Okinawan receptionist who lived with her parents in Nago on the northern part of the island. She had gotten her American nickname in college. Her friends used it, while her family and coworkers used her Japanese birth name. Eve was sleepy-eyed and cool, soft-spoken and sweet. Her skin was pale, freckled around her nose. Her friends teased her about this whiteness because Eve dated only Black American men. Me, I like the Black people, she told me. I never had a Japanese guy. She wasn't sure why. At first, she had liked white men, but then she had switched to African American men, Kokujin, and stuck with them. They were just more attractive. When she went out with her friends, they went to places Kokujin went. That night in December, we were headed for Saikolo, a hip hop club on Naha's International Street. In Japanese, the club's name meant dice. Eve was dressed for the occasion in a flowy red top with cutouts along the sleeves, black lace-up pants, and heels. A pair of sunglasses served as a headband in her long hair. Her friend Maiko was behind the wheel. With her free hand, Maiko drank from a can and smoked cigarettes and toyed with her cell phone. She had a face that was at once pretty and hard, mean. Onegai shimasu, Eve pleaded, asking her friend to please drive carefully as we tore around a bend. We stopped to pick up another friend, Ayako, who wore towering platform sandals and a messy bun of bleached hair atop her head. She worked on Kadena Air Base, like Maiko, and spoke English naturally. Amid a story told in Japanese, she threw in English phrases like, "He damn ugly." Camp Kinser passed on the right before the landscape turned urban, becoming more Osaka than American suburb. Crammed together high-rises replaced the sprawl of fast food joints, used car lots, and boxy one-story homes. In Naha, we parked off the freeway and headed to International Street. By day, the area was crowded with tourists perusing tropical-themed souvenirs. By night, music thudded from bars, clubs, and izakayas. Saikolo was down a flight of stairs, subterranean. As we walked in, I overheard a white guy trying to convince a woman to leave with him. He was using all kinds of twisted logic, and she was smiling, not giving in, but maybe about to. Inside, the club was terraced like a Balinese rice paddy and crowded with men. The DJ was playing Jermaine Dupri's Welcome to Atlanta. Most of the patrons were Black, like Eve had said, with a few white and Latino men here and there. I spotted one Asian American guy, identifiable with his military haircut, and a handful of Okinawan and Japanese guys, stylish in their caps and sneakers. Among the female club goers, Okinawan and mainland Japanese, some looked confident, at ease, striking in their dramatic makeup and tight outfits. Others were more casual, sticking to their perimeters, looking nervous but excited. Women like Eve, who only wanted to date American men, were common on the island, to such an extent that they had formed a subculture. One quality was a similar affectation and style. Women transformed their appearances, mannerisms, and speech to some approximation of the race and culture of men they wanted to date. With deep tans, gold jewelry, and slang, they tried to creep toward a foreign world. So, I was really interested in this subculture of women who only want to date American men, often just of one race. And in Okinawa, there's a slang word that's often derogatory for this group, which is amejo. And this group is often known for the way they try to appear and act more, quote unquote, American. That could mean a little more overtly sexy than other Okinawan women, a little more outspoken, a little less concerned with what others think. To me, thinking about Eve, she, came to represent how some Okinawans have come to shape their identities in relation to the bases. Younger generations have grown up in the shadow of these bases, and they digest American culture, including ideas of race and racism. I saw that it was problematic that Eve only wanted to date Black American men. Instead of finding a life partner, she often seemed to be chasing this fantasy or this stereotypical image of what a Black American man is. At the same time, I saw that she was using this situation to reinvent herself and assert parts of her identity that otherwise might have remained hidden. She was using the base presence to get something that she wanted, and that was an escape from traditional Japanese gender roles, which can be, very stifling for a woman. Also in Okinawa, some women expressed to me that they felt especially connected to American service members of color because of a shared experience of facing discrimination from the dominant population. So, for Okinawans, that would be from Japanese people, in the case of the service members, from white Americans. There's a renowned Okinawan photographer named Mao Ishikawa who documented relationships like these just after the Vietnam War, when Mao was working in a base town bar that was also a Black Panther hangout. And these are a few of her photos here. Mao told me that working at that bar, she found that she felt more comfortable with Black men than with Okinawan men. She thought the men treated her and the other bar workers more like their equals. And later she realized her bond with these men was about their shared struggles. And I'm going to read just a little bit more about Mao. Mao had started out wanting to photograph American soldiers, but realized the Okinawan women working in the bars were more interesting. On a small island that could feel socially claustrophobic, these women managed to be free-spirited, uninhibited. They didn't care when prejudiced family and friends judged them for hanging out with, dating, loving Black men. The women enjoyed their lives, enjoyed their bodies, enjoyed sex unapologetically. In this, Mao recognized a more extreme version of herself, and she felt overwhelmed by their way of life. To her, these women were like akabana, the beautiful red flower that grows everywhere on Okinawa, the one you picked if you didn't have money to buy a bouquet when you visited a grave. She decided to follow their example, care even less what others thought. There are those who look down on women who work at military bars, she writes. They assume that the women are prostitutes. That is a total misconception. The bar girls were living their lives to the fullest. So this again was the 1970s, and it's an example of Okinawan women using the US military base presence to live their lives in a way that they felt was difficult in local Okinawan and Japanese society. Another very different way locals in Okinawa are interacting with the US military presence is fighting to remove it. This is me with Suzuyo Takazato, who's one of the best known anti-base activists in Okinawa. And one of the things she's doing is leading an effort to document all cases of US military violence against women since the end of World War II. So this is a big task they've undertaken, and they have put together this list of crimes that they've been able to find. So it just lists incident after incident. You can see, looking at it, that most of them did not lead to any legal consequences for the perpetrators. And also, when you read through it, you really get a sense of this everyday horror of the past, when gang rapes seemed as common as collecting sweet potatoes. And it's kind of hard to hear, but I'm going to read just one short section from this list. And this is just from 2 days only in 1946, so just after the war. April 6, 1946. Around noon, a 19-year-old woman returning from work in the potato field is threatened by 4 GIs carrying guns who carry her into the tall bushes nearby and gang rape her. April 7th, 1946. A 26-year-old woman returning home after the potato digging work is carried off in a GMC military truck to an air raid shelter where she is gang raped by 6 GIs. April 7th, 1946, a 28-year-old woman is talking with her husband after dinner when 3 GIs break into the house, hold down the husband, and gang rape the woman. So, you know, this horrific stuff, this is evidence really that shows that sexual assault by US service members has long been a problem in Okinawa, especially during the war and occupation years when Okinawans didn't have any rights, and soldiers who committed sexual assault usually didn't face any consequences for their actions. After Okinawa became a part of Japan again in 1972, American servicemen more often faced consequences for their crimes, but this issue has continued. The most notorious incident was probably in 1995 when 3 US servicemen brutally gang raped a 12-year-old Okinawan girl. And this was an incident that sparked mass protests against the US military presence in Okinawa, largely because of the efforts of Suzuyo Takazato, which I talk about in my book, who fought to publicize it. You know, unlike that incident, most sexual assaults remains unknown, unreported. And so, as Suzuyo points out, it's much more of a problem than many people know. There are many other reasons people protest the bases in Okinawa. There's noise pollution, environmental degradation, military and traffic accidents. This is Marine Corps Air Station Futenma. It's been called the most dangerous base in the world, and I think you can see why. There's this busy flight line in the middle of a densely packed city. The city actually has been said to have the density of Chicago. So you can imagine a foreign military base in the center of Chicago and what that might be like. There have been accidents around this base. A helicopter crashed into a university bordering it. A piece of a helicopter fell on an elementary school not long ago, missing the nearest child by just 15 feet. So everyone pretty much agrees this base at least needs to close. The United States and Japan have said they will close it, but only on the condition of building another bigger base in the north of the island. This is the location of that new proposed base. This is Ora Bay. And I'm going to read just one final section from my book, from the chapter called Chie. On a bay as flat and gray as the sky, Chie Miyagi paddled out to confront the United States and Japan. It was a cold February morning in 2017, 8 years after Chie had taken me to a cave where schoolgirls like her mother, Sachiko, had toiled as nurses during the war. Now 58 years old, Chie was a local high school English teacher and peace activist known for her extroversion, individuality, and collection of rainbow outfits and fake flowers she tucked into her hair. Her English nickname was Sunshine. On Ora Bay, her highlighter pink jacket and neon orange kayak were bursts of color, while the other 8 kayakers with her were dressed in black. All 9 had concealed their faces with hats, sunglasses, and bandanas. Together, they represented a range of ages and backgrounds, those who were young and those who were retired, those who were Okinawan and those who were from mainland Japan. We are born in different places and we have different jobs, Chie said, but our goal is one. We will protect Ora Bay. The group was called Henoko Blue, and they did this regularly. paddling to where the new Mammoth U.S. military base was being built in a district of Nago called Henoko on the eastern coast. The construction site was the bay, which was, for the moment at least, gorgeous and biologically diverse, home to coral reef ecosystems and the endangered Okinawa dugong, a revered manatee-like creature that grazed on rare seagrass. The US military wanted to fill in the bay with 21 million cubic meters of rock, sand, and gravel and build a double runway, state-of-the-art behemoth. The landfill work had resumed recently after a hiatus, with the crew drilling for survey work and dropping concrete blocks into the water. Henoko Blue's mission for the day was to stop or slow any scheduled construction. Chie's larger mission was to end the US military presence in Okinawa. She, like the other kayakers, was willing to risk her life to achieve it. So this is Chie there out in her kayak on the bay. And here's some of the other kayakers with her in this group, Henoko Blue. So they told me that the Japanese Coast Guard who patrols this water would often get violent with them, holding their faces in the water, choking them, flipping their kayaks, but they felt so strongly about this that they would continue to do this regularly, some, once a week, multiple times a week. They're just some of the Okinawans who are protesting this site. There are many more on land. So for a long time, people have been holding a sit-in outside the gates, and they're trying to stop the construction trucks from coming through, or at least slow down the construction. A lot of these protesters are older Okinawan people who lived through the Battle of Okinawa, and their direct experience with war is what motivates them to demilitarize their island. This man told me about his brother who was killed in that war. This is more from that site. They try to stop cars coming from base, and then security comes out and removes them, and people have been injured this way too. So this is a situation that's still going on today. Okinawan people have voted to say they don't want this new base. It's been discovered there are real engineering issues with building this base. The seafloor, I guess, is like mayonnaise, and they're trying to, fill it in and build a base on top of it. So far, the Japanese government has ignored this, and construction crews have started dumping the sand and gravel into the water. So I think you can see the situation in two ways. One, Okinawans have been protesting this new base for decades, really since 1996 when it was announced. They've been doing it here on the ground. They've been doing it through local government, and despite all their efforts, they haven't succeeded in stopping it. On the other hand, they have succeeded in significantly slowing down this project and exposing it as kind of a disaster. This base was originally supposed to be finished in 2014 and cost $3.3 billion, which Japan is paying for. Now the Japanese government estimates it will take at least 12 more years to complete and cost at least $9.6 billion. Recently, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a US think tank, said it appears unlikely that this base will ever be completed. So to wrap it up, Okinawans aren't just victims in this geopolitical game. They are players, and they have the agency to help the US military bases remain or to resist them. And I would love to hear from all of you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Akemi, for that very interesting talk. I want to invite our participants now to ask questions and make comments. You can do this by typing your question into the Q&A box, in which case I will read it, or you can use the hand raise function to indicate you want to ask a question, and I will call upon you and you can voice your own question. Well, while people are collecting their thoughts, perhaps I could ask a quick question. I'm interested in your choice of informants, if that is the correct word. And I was wondering, were you trying to find a sort of wide range of opinions, or was it the personalities of the individuals that attracted you?
Yeah, I mean, it was both. I at some point I decided I wanted to structure it this way, where I would have different chapters, each profiling a different woman. And then I wanted kind of a cast of characters who represented the different ways that women can interact with the US military presence. So I had, so somebody who works on base, someone who works in the entertainment area outside the base, someone married to a US service member, these different kind of categories. And then it was a matter of finding the right person who I could write about in that sense. Of course, a lot of it was who was willing to share their story with me, and kind of let me into their life in that way. So that's what took some time, is finding the right people for that.
Interesting. Well, I've got a couple of questions now. One is, did the Okinawans you met identify as Japanese? How do younger Okinawans conceptualize their identity?
That's a great question. And it's something I kind of, struggled with in the book. It's like, should I refer to people as Okinawan or Japanese? Unless I asked them directly, I didn't know how they identified. And I think it is very personal and probably situational too, that a lot of people might identify, first as Okinawan, second as Japanese, or maybe first as Japanese, second as Okinawan. Maybe it depends on the situation. I think there has been a resurgence of Okinawan pride, and more people calling themselves Okinawan, Uchinanchu in the native language, studying the native language. But I think there are other people too who would consider themselves Japanese. So I think what I found, it really depends on the individual person and maybe the context too.
So I guess there's agency in relation to that issue as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another question. Do Okinawans and people around bases elsewhere in Japan, like Yokosuka, connect? And maybe this is in relation to anti-base activists, or do Okinawans, or have Okinawans built a kind of unique strategy?
That's a great question. So when I was there in Okinawa, I was lucky enough to attend this conference that was happening while I was there. And it was a group, the exact name is escaping me, but it was a group of women from all over the world who were working to protest US military bases in their area. So there were representatives from Hawaii, the Philippines, South Korea, a lot of different places. And so they had all gathered in Okinawa to come together and to share their strategies, share their experiences, and then also learn from each other. And so I think a lot of them said that Okinawa was an example they looked up to in terms of resistance and the long running anti-base movement. And so there definitely is that network of people. Yeah.
Another very interesting question. I wonder about the dynamics between the real Okinawans, that is, families who have been there for generations, and transplanted Japanese from the mainland. Is this a distinction that is made between people? And if there is, how does this play out in relation to the US bases?
That's a good question. I mean, I think, I actually didn't meet that many transplants myself, but I know there are obviously there are a lot there. So I didn't really see this stark distinction. I think actually there are quite a few people who come from the mainland to get involved in the anti-base movement.
Mhm.
Um, so some of those kayakers were from mainland Japan. So there are people who come, with specifically with that goal, and there is some tension there because they're accused of kind of co-opting the movement and not deferring to local Okinawan activists. Um, and then I'm sure there are many others who come and have no part in that movement, and just settle into Okinawa. And I would think, there's intermarriage going on, and there's definitely some integration happening there too.
Um, Could you please repeat the name of the group compiling the list of sexual assault and murder cases by American soldiers since World War II? And could you share some information about the project and your relationship or interactions with members of the group?
Yeah, so this is Suzu. So you could look up Suzuyo Takazato is the woman leading this group, and it's a long name. It's Okinawa Women Act Against U.S. Military Violence, I think, is something like that. But I think if you Google Suzuyo Takazato, you can find that. And so she's been involved in this for a long time. I profile her in one of the chapters, and she's organized this group of mostly women, and they've to come up with that list. They've like combed the archives. They've done oral histories. They've really kind of looked at newspapers, every source they can to try to put together this list of incidents. But as they like to emphasize that Okinawa Women Act Against Military Violence. They this is a small number of the actual number, so it's best not to focus on the number in their list, because you can only ever uncover a fraction of the actual number of assault that's happening. And this came about because after the 1995 rape, there will be a lot of journalists coming in saying, how common is this problem, right? They wanted numbers, and there were no numbers. So they put this together. But again, they don't like to emphasize, there's been X number of crimes.
Another comment here. Thank you for your very interesting talk. I am wondering what happens when pro-American women such as Eve meet with anti-military activists such as Suzuyo Takazato, or when one woman embodies both sentiments, for example, opposed to the US military, but dependent upon it for livelihood, or perhaps married to someone who's in the military. What sort of dynamics ensue? And can you talk a bit more about these complex dynamics and how they are reflected in women's lives?
Yeah, that's a great question, and complicated. And I think that's something I wanted to explore throughout the book. So many of these women's stories contain those types of tensions, and I found that is so common in Okinawa, and to me that was kind of missing from the dialogue a lot of the time, because it was this idea that like you're either for or against, but so many people had like you mentioned, these kind of conflicting relationships with the bases, or many different ways they interacted with the bases, all in one person, all in one family. There's so many examples. So that photographer I mentioned, Mao Ishikawa, she is also an anti-base activist. And so, she had this formative experience when she was younger, dating and hanging out with American servicemen. And now she's very active in fighting to close the bases. I profile a woman who is married to a US service member, and her parents were against the bases when she was growing up. Her mom was like out there with a protest sign, and then she married a US serviceman. And she said because of that, her parents don't feel like they can protest the bases anymore. There's another young activist I have in the book who, she was speaking out against the base presence, and then she brought her friend, an American serviceman, to the gates outside Schwab, the protest site, one day, and another activist said to her, like, I didn't know you were that kind of girl. So there are so many of these tensions playing out, I think, for most people probably. And for me, I thought there needs to be more of a recognition and discussion of that, and just an acceptance that that's the reality, and that the discussion should proceed from there, and not this idea that it's a polarized situation that you're either for or against.
Thank you. We do have a raised hand from one of our attendees. Rebecca, would you like to ask your question? You'll need to unmute yourself, please.
Or they might need to unmute her if that.
Oh, that's a good point. Connie, can you unmute Rebecca?
We cannot forcibly.
Oh,
Sorry, that was a mistaken raised hand, apparently.
oh, it was. Okay, well
Yeah.
then I will go back to my Q&A. Sorry about that.
I see another raised hand though.
Oh, do you? Okay. Do we have another raised hand?
Maybe it's
Yeah.
gone.
Let me go on and go back to the Q&A box.
Okay.
I am wondering if the USA or Japan has numerical data on the permanent relationships or marriage. That is, what percentage of men who go to Japan take their Japanese wives or partners back to the USA? And I wonder if you have any comparison with Korea's camp town. I understand that women other than Japanese, Filipinas, for example, are increasing on the bases. Oh, quite a few questions. Also, I wonder if you had a chance to speak to US service women, and if so, what do they say about their position? So one question is about, whether people stay in Okinawa or go back to the US. The other is about whether you see any difference between sort of base culture in Okinawa versus Korea. A third question has to do with other Asian women who are married to American servicemen in Okinawa. And then finally about women in the military.
Okay, so I'll try to remember all those. So I don't think I saw like numbers, percentage of people who would, like, couples who would go back to the US or stay in Okinawa. I think that oftentimes couples would do both. So they might be in Okinawa for a little while and then spend some time in the States, maybe come back. So there was kind of like a transnational movement happening with these couples. I did find that a lot of US servicemen who marry Okinawan women want to stay in Okinawa. That's just kind of anecdotally my experience. There are many who retire there, who never leave the island. And that was like the case of that man who committed that crime. He was kind of one of these men who married a local woman, left the military, but stayed in Okinawa. And because of this, civilian contractor employment, he could work on base in English, never have to get a job, in Japanese society. And you can pretty easily stay there in Okinawa. So I think that was a very common scenario. In terms of looking at South Korea, I didn't spend a lot of time looking at it there, but I would think that there are similarities. And you mentioned the like Filipino women who are there around bases, I guess in South Korea, and that's definitely true in Okinawa. One of the things I really wanted to do was to include the voice of a Filipino woman in this book, because since I think about the 80s, Filipino women have been the ones largely working in the entertainment areas around the bars in Okinawa, and I couldn't find much information about them and their stories. I had heard that they were trafficking victims and maybe they were like locked up in these horrific situations. So I was able to talk to one woman in depth, and she's the one I profile. And like kind of what I was talking about before, she defied this victim narrative and she emphasized her agency and that this was a choice she made to come to Japan to work in these areas. And, she knew the risks and she took that chance and she used the situation to really build a life that she wanted to. And so it was kind of an unexpected narrative. And then the US service women, that is something I wish I had been able to do, and I didn't. I did notice I started going to Okinawa in around, well, really the first time was like in 2003, but when I lived there for a year in 2008, and then I went back in 2017, I saw over the course of that time, there were more and more women in the military. And so I just, even in the course of that time, I saw that change. And in one way, a vivid way I saw it change was that the last time I was there and I was in a bar outside of base, when they had a wet t-shirt contest, instead of Okinawan Japanese women on stage, they were US service women on stage in this wet t-shirt contest. And so it seemed like that was very different than the last time I had been there, when Okinawan and Japanese women were the ones really sexualized in these spaces. So that's something I would love to have had. I do profile a woman married to a US service member who's American. And so looking at kind of the American military wives who are in Okinawa.
Thank you. So the next question, sort of about the geopolitics of the area. Thank you for your excellent and informative talk. Does the issue of Taiwan hang over the heads of the Okinawans, or is it in the background?
So does it hang over the heads? I mean, from what I saw, I don't know, I saw more China come up as a topic when I was there. And I saw it very divided. I mean, I think with Taiwan, there's some affinity. Some people see an affinity there. I mean, they're very close geographically.
Sure.
There's some parallels in the history there. So I think there's some people feel an affinity with Taiwan, and there's certainly a lot of tourists coming over and exchange that way. I think there was a governor when I was there who wanted to kind of strengthen that relationship. And then in terms of China, I saw really a divide, like that some people thought this was generally, maybe more pro-base people saw China as a threat that they needed to, that justified the existence of US military bases in Okinawa. And then more anti-base people might tell me that China never did anything to Okinawa. The US and Japan are the ones who have invaded and colonized Okinawa, and so there was nothing to fear with China. So I saw that's kind of the dialogue I saw around China.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So we have a bit of time left, so please do raise questions either by writing it in the Q&A box or by raising your hand.
And I'll
Well,
say my, oh, go ahead.
go ahead. No, you go
I was going
ahead.
to say my book just came out in Japanese, so that's been exciting for me too, and just to start getting some readers in Okinawa and Japan. So I don't know if if anyone's there who has read it in Japanese or is living in Japan or Okinawa. I'd love to hear from you.
That's wonderful. Congratulations. While we're waiting for people to collect their thoughts, I wanted to return to the issue of racism that you raised in the way in which some Okinawan women sort of pursue one race or another. And I was wondering, I know it's not a very large number, but where do Asian American men kind of fit into this sort of spectrum of sexual preferences or romantic partner preferences?
Yeah. I mean, when I was there, it was like non-existent. But I'm sure there are many women who are interested in Asian American men, but there wasn't a word for it. And that told me that it wasn't the same phenomenon on the same level. There were words for only likes Black men, only likes white men, only likes Latino men. And that was where it stopped. So, to me, it was a lot about race, right? And looking for someone not of your own race. And so I don't know if that's what was kind of preventing that type of lusting for, Asian American men in particular.
We've got a question. If there's time for another question, there is indeed. I would be curious to know about tipping culture in these areas. Is it American style at 20%, or is it Japanese style without the expectation of tips? That's a very interesting question.
Are you about to travel there? Maybe. I think my experience, if you're off base, you would not tip. It's Japanese style. And then if you're on base, on base is like a little America. And it is just a very stark difference in terms of like culture, customs, and then also the geography. And that's something I write about in the book, is that if you look on the other side of the fence, it's just like this wide green lawns and so much space, huge parking lots, like not a lot of people. And then outside of the fence in Okinawa, it's just like completely crowded, dense traffic jams. And so it's really like night and day. So I think in my experience, it would be, outside of the gates, you would be doing it the Japanese way. If you cross over the gates, you'd be doing it the American way.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have time for one or two more questions if you'd like to raise your hands or write your question in the Q&A box. Here we go. Could Okinawa and to some extent mainland Japan be considered a neo-colony of the US? And that is why there is such a struggle to remove the bases from Okinawa, despite the fact that there is strong support for their removal.
Yeah, I think a lot of people see this as a colonial situation, an ongoing colonial situation, and also a dual colonial situation, so that it's Japan and the United States. And that's an important distinction, I think, because really Okinawans are, who are involved in trying to remove the bases, they're fighting against two different superpowers, right? Japan and the United States. And because of that, the Japan and the United States can kind of play off each other in this situation too, and say, the US can say, well, it's Tokyo that wants this new base here, we're just going along with it. And then, Tokyo can say, well, Washington wants this here, or they're the ones kind of pushing for this. So I think Okinawa is in a unique position because of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The next question is a timely one. how has the COVID pandemic, or has the, well, I guess I would say, how has the COVID pandemic sort of played out in relation to sort of tensions in Okinawa? Have there been more protests against the bases based upon, I know there have been outbreaks among people in the military in Okinawa and other bases. And while the pandemic has been pretty well contained in Japan generally.
Yeah. I have heard that it did increase some tension because local Okinawa government could enact certain COVID restrictions, right? But they don't have jurisdiction over the bases. And so what was going on base, it was out of their control, and there were outbreaks happening on base among service members who could then leave base, right, and bring it to the Okinawan community. So there's this real right feeling of helplessness that you can't control part of your island, right? That there's these people who are living under a different set of regulations than the rest of the people. And I think for a while there was a particularly high rate of COVID in Okinawa compared to other parts of Japan. Probably tourism might play a part of that too. So I think for some people it probably did increase their anger or frustration against the base presence. And I think also, logistically, it might have stalled the protest that I showed you the pictures of, right? Because the people didn't want to gather. But I think now at least people are back out there in person protesting.
Thank you. Do you have a sense of the opportunities Okinawan women and American servicemen have to meet and interact with one another in the borderland spaces during the past? Well, it looks like the question was cut off, but I think that the question is about, where are these relationships forged? Are they, I guess there are women who are working on the bases. What did happen there? What does it tend to happen more in sort of entertainment areas and the like?
I think all of those areas there, I think there are multiple opportunities. It's very easy to meet people, but certainly, there are certain bar areas where it's known where Americans will hang out. It's usually wherever there's a gate in the fence, right? That area will become the entertainment area and bar area. And so Okinawan or Japanese women who want to meet American men, they might go to these specific places, like I read in that excerpt, and look for American servicemen. But then it can also happen, more kind of naturally in different spaces around the island. And then also there are women who work on base. I think especially after the war, a lot of the work in Okinawa was related to the base, like domestic work on base, or and so that I think in that time period, a lot of women probably met American service members at work on the base.
Okay, so there's two questions that address sort of young people, and perhaps I'll read them both and you can approach them together or not. One is about the youth involvement in anti-base activity. So whether there's a kind of generational divide between those who are activists and those who are not. And then the second question says, I know that activists like Takasato have been active since the 70s and belong to an older generation of feminist and anti-base movement activists. Is there a new generation of activists stepping up to carry on this legacy? If there is a new generation of activists stepping up to carry on their legacy, do you see any differences in their philosophy towards things like racism or sexism, and their understanding of the geopolitics of Okinawa and the bases there?
Okay, great questions. Yes, there's definitely a generational divide happening. and it's a concern some people have, is that, most of the activists are older. If you look at that picture of kind of the people sitting outside the base, right? I mean, they're mostly older Okinawans. I mean, one, those are the people who are retired and they have the time to do that. But two, because this is still such a politicized subject in Okinawa, there's some pressure not to speak out, or you'll face a lot of criticism. And so if you're younger, you have a career, you're still trying to establish yourself in that way, you might be hesitant to do it. One of the last woman I profiled in this book is named Ai Tamaki, and she is a young Okinawan woman who was involved in the anti-base movement. And I talked in there a little bit about her struggles. Because of this speaking out, she faced incredible backlash, I think, from a lot of mainland people, people sending her death threats, threatening her in other ways. And just, she had to withstand a lot of this. And she was also the one who brought her US serviceman friend to the protest. And another one said, are you that kind? I didn't know you were that kind of girl, right? So I think for the younger people, they might feel like they have more to lose in this. And then also I think there is a difference in that they might see the situation in a little bit more nuanced way, where they can have American servicemen friends and then still, fight against the US military presence, or be even romantically involved in a US serviceman and still be involved in the protest movement. Whereas maybe some people in the older generation don't understand that kind of what it seems like a contradiction to them. So I think to bring in younger people, that I think there needs to be more of a recognition of this kind of duality, or nuanced relationships with the bases that people might have.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. We're getting a little bit short on time, but somebody raised a question that I also wanted to ask you, and that is, what is going to be your next project?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I'm working on a more personal story this time. I'm looking at my own family history in California, especially my grandparents and great-grandparents' experience being incarcerated during World War II in the Japanese American concentration camps. And so I'm looking at that, and then also some other kind of threads in that history that I think we don't know as much about. But I found out that my grandfather renounced his citizenship during World War II when he was incarcerated. He was born in California, but renounced his citizenship, and something we didn't know about. So I'm looking into that story.
Oh, it's fascinating. Thank you. That we look forward to, we'll have to do another book talk when you finish.
I would love to. I'd love to.
And then one final question. The US military is in Okinawa ostensibly to defend the islands, and as well as American interest in the Asia Pacific area. So the claim, of course, is that Okinawa and the rest of Japan are being protected by the US. So the questioner asked, to what extent do Okinawan people feel they are being protected?
I think that's another one that's, in my experience, very divided. People saw that very different ways. I mean, and it was, again, kind of whether you were pro or anti-base, but pro-base people would say that, like you just said, like, this is for our protection, this is protecting us, it's for our benefit, right? But then anti-base people would say something very different, and they would list all those crimes, that I talked about. This is harming us, right? This presence is harming us, and then it is also making us more of a target, a military target. Otherwise, we're just a little island here and nobody will be interested in us, right? But if there are all these military bases here, it makes us more vulnerable. So there are very different arguments in either direction there.
Thank you. Well, we're going to have to draw our very interesting conversation to an end now. But I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening. And I want to give, of course, a special thank you to our guest speaker. I know we would all be clapping now if we were in person, but we'll give you sort of a virtual
I wish I could
clap.
see your faces. Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you for joining us. There will be another installment of our series, East Asia by the Book, on Tuesday, November 16th, also at 5 p.m. And that talk will feature author and scholar David J. Mosina, who will be discussing his book, Nodding the Banner, Ritual and Relationship in Taoist Practice, and a link with more information and to register for this event, just check out our chat box again. If you're interested in previously held book talks, or you'd like to listen to this one again, you can visit our CEAS YouTube channel. Yes, we have one. We are in the 21st century. There are numerous recorded events from years past that are available for your viewing pleasure, and you can find a direct link to the channel, again, in the chat box. So Akemi, thank you so much. It was a wonderful talk. I've read the book and I recommend it to our attendees. It's a really enjoyable read, a lovely stylist, but also so informative to tell us something beyond the sort of usual story about US-American relations in, US-Japan relations in Okinawa. So thank you all again and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you so much.